Let's quickly move over to the first interview. We have our guest joining us virtually. He is Ikemesit Effiong. He's the head of research at SBM Intelligence, and we're talking about the 500 billion naira palliatives announcement that came in from Mr. President yesterday. He is seeking the approval from the House of Representatives. Hello, Ikemesit, and thank you for joining us on the show today.
Hello and good morning. Thanks for having me, Nancy.
Now, good morning to you. Ikemesit, can you help our viewers understand how this 500 billion naira palliatives is coming about? You'll recall that the World Bank has approved actually 800 million US dollars for as palliatives, so to speak, for this petrol subsidy. From what we saw yesterday, this request is coming out from the 2022 Appropriation Act. So please, can you just explain the dynamics of this so that our viewers can understand?
Okay, so basically.
Hello, Ikemesit, are you still there? Okay. The network, it seems I can still hear him.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Okay, yes, I can hear you now. So you can go ahead.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay. So there was a supplementary budget that was approved last year in 2022 under the life cycle of the previous administration. And basically what the president said in his letter to the National Assembly this week is that they want to cut out 500 billion naira out of that supplementary budget that has already been approved by the National Assembly and specifically channel that sum towards offering palliative and remediative efforts in order to cushion the effects of the fuel subsidy. The assumption is that this will mostly be targeted at low and middle income Nigerians, although the exact details haven't been quite spelled out, or they weren't quite spelled out in the letter or in any other policy documents on the part of the federal government. I suppose one of the things that lawmakers would have to do would be to require some sort of explanation, right, of guarantees on part of the federal executive in terms of how these monies would directly be spent. Where the situation around the $800 million loan that the World Bank had offered to Nigeria comes in is that under the Buhari administration, there was talk of removing the fuel subsidy. And pursuant to that talk, the World Bank committed to aiding Nigeria to the tune of $800 million in order $800 million in palliative measures in order to cushion the effects of the fuel subsidy. The World Bank, the IMF, a lot of institutional investors and partners, and even organizations like ours have been saying for years that the fuel subsidy is an inefficient conduit, right? That through which Nigeria continues to manage, right, and fuel demand, right, in the country, and it should go. And these calls have been persistent for years. So the World Bank made this commitment in 2021, but when the Buhari administration backtracked on those fuel subsidy removal commitments, I should say, by consistently moving forward the timeline for the removal of the subsidy, the World Bank basically just stayed put on that. So that particular sum is not a new pot of money that's being made available to Nigeria. It's also worth mentioning that it's actually a loan and not a grant, right? So it's going to add, maybe not substantially, but to certainly add to the to the country's debt obligations. But the World Bank has restated this year that that pot of money still remains available. And now that the subsidy has been removed, the country can basically activate that line of funding. So from both the domestic channel through the supplementary budget, which has to be provisioned for somehow, the assumption is that that will probably happen through a new debt raising fund, a new debt raise round. And also that World Bank conduit. The assumption and the thinking right now, at least, is that a substantial amount of money will be channeled towards social interventions and palliative interventions to cushion the effect that the fuel subsidy removal has had on the economy, especially in terms of, rising food prices, rising transportation costs, and all of those other attendant flow-through effects that we're currently seeing in the economy.
Okay, since the president announced this yesterday, there seems to be some kind of skeletal information. We really do not have so much regarding this piece of information, but we're just trying to put all of them together. The 800 million US dollars loan from the World Bank for this effect, now 500 billion naira request from the House of Representatives. Let's take a look at the social intervention systems in Nigeria. We know there's an office called NASCO, the National Social Safety Net, yes, coordinating office. Those are the people responsible for the National Social Registry. And the last data that I have, according to them, is that they do have about 15.7 million households that are covered in terms of social registry. How do you think that this intervention, this palliative, should be handled? Because Nigerians do not have trust when they hear palliatives. We saw what happened in 2020, and of course, the RRR, the Rapid Response Registry, came out also in 2020 to use mobile technology to get people on board, especially the rural areas, to be able to get COVID-19 palliatives across to them. So how do you think that President Tinubu should go ahead with these social intervention program that should be different from what we saw in 2020 and a few years ago?
Well, I mean, the targeting has to certainly be better. Like you said, there is a nascent social infrastructure program that exists. 15.7 million households. If we multiply that by the NBS's average family size for the Nigerian household, which is 5 persons, right, it gives us something right in the 80 odd million Nigerians mark. But we also have the United Nations say, for example, that because of the adverse economic conditions, because of insecurity, and now the fuel subsidy removal has become an extra stress point. Something like 100 million Nigerians, right, will be dealing with varying levels of food insecurity, for example, right? The thinking is that by the end of the year, an extra 10 million Nigerians would have also fallen below the poverty line, right, as it were, and we spend a minuscule amount of money, right, on social safety to begin with. There's no comprehensive program like Social Security, for example, right, that you have in the United States, or any of the welfare programs that you see in other European countries, right? So, two things come to mind. One is that this may probably be the opportunity, the kick in the hide, basically, that we need in order to put in the hard work of developing a social safety program, right? In countries where welfare programs exist, it was often times of real, catastrophe or war or adverse economic conditions that led to the development of these social safety nets, right? In the United States, for example, the Great Depression was the launching pad for the Social Security program, right? That's, that they currently have right now. So Nigeria, while not dealing with an economic depression, that there's talk about the country potentially flirting with recession territory this year or early next year, is certainly in a situation where hundreds of millions of people need some sort of support. And now is as good a time as any in order to develop those arrangements. The second part has to do with the messaging, right? And the consistency of it. So there are important indicators that needs to be clearly spelled out by governments, right? Governments, I think, should not just stop at just insisting that they are going to allocate a certain bucket of money towards palliatives. Important questions around the around the who, when, why, all of the classic tenets of journalism, as you're familiar with, right, Nancy? So who's going to be who's going to be a beneficiary, under this scheme? What are the demographic or the income thresholds? How long do you need to have been out of work, or do you need to be in work, but you're earning below a certain amount of money? Is there going to be any form of geographic targeting or industry or sectoral targeting, right, as it were for these palliatives? Which office definitively will manage the administration of these palliatives? During COVID, right, the Humanitarian Affairs Ministry at the time was the point federal government agency, right, for the management of these palliatives. What's going to be the role of the states and the local governments? Very little has been said about that. And if you remember, from 2020 and COVID, a lot of the states did complain that, they were unrepresented, or they were underrepresented rather, in terms of the distribution, right, of palliatives. Will the National Assembly, it is assumed, will they exercise oversight functions? If they will, under what guise, what committee, right, would be, will coordinate this, right, on that side? What sort of reporting, right, should Nigerians expect from this federal government effort? Are we looking at weekly briefings as we saw during COVID, or something monthly or quarterly? Would there be any sort of technological infrastructure through it Nigerians will need to apply, for example, for these palliatives? Or is it going to be a situation where, the government just does its own targeting, and then you get a message from the government basically saying that you are eligible, right, to be a beneficiary under the scheme? So there are important questions that still needs to be answered. It's also worth noting that a lot of this movement is happening in an environment where we don't yet have a cabinet, or a substantive cabinet, as it were. So who is going to be the minister, or who is going to be the government official who's primarily responsible and accountable, first to the president and by extension to the Nigerian people, for the administration and the execution of this program? So there are a host of unanswered questions that needs to be put in place. The National Assembly has promised that they'll move very quickly on this. I saw some reporting that said that the lawmakers will begin to consider this new proposal as early as today. I don't know whether that will actually happen, right? But all of these important moving parts and all of these unanswered questions really need to be addressed and engaged with, in order for, like you said, that historical mistrust, right, that Nigerians have had in government efforts at running the economy, in order for those, historic misgivings to be sufficiently addressed and abated.
Okay, Ikemesit, last question to you. How can we measure the impact of the palliatives? I liked what you said around how we need, at this time, this new administration need to put in place a very a good scheme to be able to socially protect the poor. And I heard Mr. President also say that yesterday. The World Bank recommended that perhaps 5,000 naira should go to the poor and the vulnerable, that petrol subsidy removal will impact. And one interesting thing the World Bank said, that 5,000 naira is about 6% of the expenditure of what the poor and the economically insecure spend. So perhaps a 5,000 naira to a very poor person, an extremely poor person in Nigeria, is so much money. The question now is, how do we measure that impact? How do we measure the impact vis-a-vis some other countries that have also successfully implemented their social protection programs, like in Philippines, like in Indonesia, even Ghana, our next door neighbor, came up with a program called Livelihoods Empowerment Alleviation Empowerment Program, or so, LEAP, when it did remove fuel subsidies. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, the ultimate measure would be whether people are able to get themselves on a sound economic footing, using that government support, and then they do not become eligible, right? For that level of support. Typically, what you've seen in developed and developing economies is that if you have a disproportionate amount of the population, especially if you're approaching something like 20 or 30 or 40% of the population who basically, without the aid of social programs, are effectively poor. That's an unsustainable state of affairs. You want a situation where people are not only economically productive, but they are able to create, substantial economic value for themselves and for their families and for their dependents, right? Yeah. So while in the early onset of this, there will be a lot of Nigerians who would be eligible under this scheme. I think ultimately the success of the program will be determined by how many Nigerians we can funnel through and then off, right, the scheme, because they become, sufficiently economically empowered that they do not need, right, this level of support. The targeting part, like, as you highlighted, right, is a really, really important one, I think. And that's one that lawmakers, I mean, not just lawmakers, but people in government who actually get paid to do this as their day job, right, should really figure out. One of the challenges with administering social schemes historically, not just in this country but in many parts of the world, is the question of targeting, right? And then how do you measure that? Do you measure that by, say, the bank account balance, right, that exists to someone's name? Well, if you use that approach, most Nigerians are unbanked or underbanked. And would it be by self-reporting? Then you need to create, if it's going to be by self-reporting, where every month you basically have to tell the government how much you've earned in the previous month in order for eligibility.